Okay, let's dive straight in. How do we really know if those changes we're making in healthcare are, hitting the mark? Especially when every hospital ward feels like its own distinct world.
Yeah, it's a massive puzzle. What works wonders in one place can just fizzle out in another.
Exactly. And that's where these things called logic models come in.
Hmm.
They're supposed to be a roadmap, right? Showing how an intervention should lead to the results we want.
Precisely. For a long time, they've been the standard tool. You draw out the plan, here are the resources, the activities, the expected outcomes, a neat visual theory.
Right. But what happens when that neat path gets all tangled up depending on the actual place? That's really the core of our deep dive today.
Hmm.
We're looking at some research that basically asks, are these traditional logic models actually up to the job for complex modern healthcare stuff?
Hmm.
Stuff where you have to adapt on the fly.
And the big issue they point to is context. Traditional models often just stick context in a box off to the side.
As if it's just background noise.
Yeah.
When really it's the soil the whole thing grows in.
Right. Exactly. And the paper digs into this with a real-world example, something called the Patient Experience Toolkit, or PET.
Okay.
This was rolled out across 6 different hospital wards, aiming to improve patient experience. But the key thing, PE wasn't rigid. It had to change, sometimes quite a lot, depending on the ward.
Which naturally throws a real curveball in your standard linear logic model, doesn't it?
It really does.
So our mission today is, well, twofold. First, understand why these standard models can stumble with this complexity. And second, explore what a new kind of logic model, one designed for this dynamic reality, might look like.
Moving beyond that static blueprint idea.
Yeah, something that reflects the actual back and forth that happens when you're trying to make changes in messy, real-world settings like hospitals.
It's about acknowledging implementation isn't just following steps 1, 2, 3. It's often more like navigating a maze.
Okay, so let's start there. Why this growing need for a different way of looking at things? The paper mentions process evaluations becoming more important. What's that about?
Well, there's been a big push, partly thanks to guidance from the Medical Research Council, or MRC, to not just ask if something works, but how and why it works.
Ah, okay. Getting into the mechanisms.
Exactly. Understanding the program theory, as they call it.
Yeah,
You want the story behind the results, not just the final score.
makes total sense. But then the paper throws in a twist. It suggests this MRC guidance might be better for complicated interventions rather than complex ones.
Uh-huh.
What's the difference?
That's a really crucial distinction they make. Complicated things might have lots of parts, but they work pretty predictably across different settings. Think of maybe installing a specific type of new surgical robot.
Right. Intricate needs training, but the machine itself does the same thing everywhere.
Exactly. But complex interventions are different. They're deeply tangled up with the social system there and the culture, the relationships, the history of the place.
Okay.
So the context doesn't just influence the intervention, it actively shapes how it unfolds and what it achieves.
So, less like a machine, maybe more like trying a new teaching method. It's going to look and feel really different depending on the specific classroom, the teacher, the kids.
That's a great analogy. The paper uses school nutrition education. Even with a set curriculum, the way it's delivered, how the kids react, how the teachers engage, it all varies. The nutritionist adapts based on that specific school.
And those lines between the intervention and the context get really blurry.
They do. And this constant adaptation, this inherent flexibility, it makes evaluation tricky using the old methods.
Right. The paper talks about a debate on the right methods and questions where traditional logic models fit in this more fluid picture.
Absolutely. If the thing you're evaluating is changing shape as you watch it, how can a static map capture that? It might miss the most important parts of the story.
Okay, so before we get lost in the weeds, let's just nail down, what are logic models fundamentally? The paper mentions a glossary, but what's the core idea? Why do people use them?
At their heart, they're visual diagrams. They try to show the underlying theory, the logic of how a program's inputs and activities are supposed to connect to produce the desired outcomes.
A visual cause and effect chain.
Sort of, yeah. A simplified argument on paper.
And the supposed benefits. Why bother making one?
Well, the paper lists a few key ones. First, they help evaluators really think through how the intervention is meant to work. Forces clarity on those assumed links.
Okay, makes you articulate your assumptions.
Second, they help organize evaluation, figuring out what data you need to collect, what measures matter at each stage, helps define success.
Got it. Structure and measurement.
Third, they can be great for communication. Getting everyone involved, staff, funders, participants on the same page about what the program is and what it's trying to do. building consensus.
Right, a shared understanding.
And finally, yeah, they're useful for showing funders the rationale and for sharing lessons learned, helping others replicate or adapt the idea. Knowledge transfer.
That all sounds pretty good. Useful tools. But, as we said, the paper's main point is that the existing guidance often doesn't grapple well enough with that interaction between the intervention and the context.
That's the nub of it. Traditional models tend to see context as external. Factors that might help or hinder, sure, but not as something that actively shapes how the intervention gets delivered and modified in real time.
Which leads us nicely back to that PD intervention, the patient experience toolkit. Can you give us a bit more detail on what that actually involved on the wards?
Sure. So PD wasn't just a toolkit sitting on a shelf. It was a facilitated process. The idea was to get ward teams, nurses, doctors, support staff to really look at patient feedback data together.
Okay, actually discuss it.
Yes. And then crucially, use that reflection to spark ideas for change, using quality improvement or QI methods to actually try things out to make the patient experience better.
So it's about reflection in action.
Right. It generally involves setting up a core team on the ward, dedicated time for reflecting on the feedback, and then structured ways to plan and test changes.
And this happened across 6 different hospital wards in the north of England, you said. And these wards were deliberately chosen for their differences.
That's right. Different specialties, different staffing situations, different leadership styles, different existing cultures. That variety was key for the research.
So the researchers tried to make a standard logic model for PA and FIRST, one that would fit all 6 wards. Sounds like that didn't quite work out. Where did it fall short?
They identified 4 main ways the standard model just didn't capture the reality. First was the roles people played.
How so?
Well, who championed PE, who did the practical tasks. It varied a lot. Sometimes the ward manager was key, other times maybe a keen nurse or even a patient rep drove it. And the facilitators, the action researchers running the process, they had to constantly adjust their role based on who stepped up on the ward.
Ah, so they couldn't just assume ward manager does X.
Exactly. Sometimes the facilitators ended up doing tasks that ward staff did elsewhere. The static model couldn't show that flexibility in who was doing what.
Okay, that makes sense. What was the second issue?
The second was how the model handled moderators, those contextual factors. The initial model listed things like ward culture or organizational support, but treated them as sort of fixed conditions that either helped or hindered PT.
Right, like roadblocks or tailwinds.
Yeah. But what actually happened was that the facilitators actively responded to these factors. If a ward culture felt resistant, they'd spend more time building relationships or coaching. If hospital admin wasn't supportive, they might work behind the scenes to build bridges.
So it wasn't just context affecting the intervention. The intervention was actively trying to navigate or even change the context.
Precisely. It was a dynamic interaction, a constant give and take that the linear model just didn't show.
Okay, that's a big difference. What was third?
Third was irregular outcome patterns. Some results were consistent, like teams developing action plans, but other important outcomes were really specific to a particular ward's challenges and the facilitator's efforts there.
For example?
Like maybe in one ward, a major proximal outcome was improving team communication or shifting the ward culture towards being more open to feedback. That wasn't a universal goal, but it was a crucial achievement in that context, driven by the facilitation. The standard model aiming for uniform outcomes missed these context-specific wins.
So the results weren't identical everywhere. The intervention sparked unique local changes too. And the last limitation.
The final one was the influence of early outcomes. The initial model didn't really show how getting some early wins, seeing some positive changes happen quickly, could boost the team's morale and engagement for the harder work later on.
Ah, like a positive feedback loop.
Exactly. Success breeds success, basically. That momentum, how early proximal outcomes could grease the wheels for later implementation, wasn't captured in the linear flow.
Wow. Okay, so the traditional model assumed a fairly neat, predictable process, but the reality of PD was much more fluid. Roles shifted, strategies adapted, outcomes varied, and early steps influenced later ones.
That sums it up perfectly. And seeing these shortcomings led the researchers to look at different types of logic models. They ended up creating a typology with 4 categories.
Okay, let's hear about them. What's type 1?
Type 1 is the most basic. Think simple lists. Intervention components on one side, outcomes on the other. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation is often associated with these. Good for a very high-level overview, maybe initial planning.
But not much detail on the how or the context.
Right. It's like saying input A, activity B, outcome C. Very bare bones.
Okay, then type 2. You said the initial PET model was type 2.
Yes. Type 2 models add more detail. They'll typically show components, activities, maybe outputs, short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, often in linear boxes and arrows. And crucially, they do include moderators or context,
But how do they include them?
usually as a separate list or box influencing the main pathway. So it acknowledges context matters, but still treats it as somewhat separate from the core intervention flow. The paper mentions system-based logic models as a more sophisticated type 2, but they often maintain that separation.
So the initial PET model would have said word culture is a moderator, but didn't show that dynamic interaction we talked about.
Exactly. And the researchers noted that if you constantly have to write paragraphs explaining how the model doesn't fully capture the reality, maybe the model itself needs rethinking.
Fair point. What about type 3?
Type 3 models focus much more on the relationships between elements. They try to map out the specific causal pathways, how exactly activity X is supposed to lead to outcome Y. Driver diagrams from quality improvement are a good example.
So more detailed on the mechanisms within the intervention.
Yes, very useful for testing specific hypotheses or getting practitioners to agree on the steps needed. But they're still primarily focused on the intervention itself. They struggle to show an intervention that deliberately takes different forms in different places.
Can they show any variation?
Some type 3s include alternative causal strands, showing maybe 2 or 3 different ways things might play out. But they can't easily handle the kind of wide-ranging, context-driven adaptations seen in PET.
Okay, so types 1, 2, and 3 all have limitations when faced with these really adaptive, complex interventions, which leads us towards type 4. But first, you mentioned something called the parish model. How does that fit in?
Right. Paris promoting action on research implementation in health services. It's not strictly a logic model, more of a conceptual framework, but the researchers found it really influential.
That's its main idea.
It argues that successful implementation, getting research into practice, depends on the interplay of 3 core elements: the evidence itself, its strength and regence, the context, culture, leadership, resources, etc., and crucially, the facilitation, the support provided to help make the change happen.
Evidence, context, facilitation, interacting.
Exactly. Often shown as a Venn diagram, it inherently puts context and the process of implementation support right at the center.
And that resonated with what they saw in PRT.
Absolutely. Parallax is often used retrospectively to analyze projects, but the paper saw its potential for prospective use, thinking ahead about how you'll need to adapt your facilitation based on the specific evidence and context. That idea was key for developing Type 4.
Okay, so how did they build this type 4 model for Parrot? Using insights from Paris, how did it address those 4 limitations of the standard model?
Well, they got creative with the visuals. To address the fluid roles, they used a Venn diagram shape. It visually represented the overlap and negotiation between the facilitators and the ward teams, showing how their roles adapted based on the team's capacity and willingness.
So the visual structure itself showed the relationship wasn't fixed.
Exactly. Then, for the dynamic interaction with moderators, they placed context within the Venn diagram, distinguishing between inner context, like ward culture, and outer context, like hospital policies. This showed the range of factors facilitators had to navigate inside that relationship.
Not just external factors, but part of the interactive space.
Yeah. And for the irregular outcome patterns, they put the core consistent outcomes centrally, but showed those context-dependent proximal outcomes more peripherally. They used dotted arrows to link these, signaling they were contingent on the specific facilitation work done in response to that context.
Like saying, these outcomes might happen here if we adapt correctly.
Precisely. It highlights their conditional nature. And finally, to show the influence of early outcomes, they used double-headed arrows connecting those peripheral context-specific outcomes back to the central process.
Showing that feedback loop, early wins, strengthening later work.
Yes. It visually represents how success in tackling a context-specific issue could build capacity and momentum for the core PTT activities later on.
So this type 4 model sounds much more focused on the core principles or mechanisms of PT and how facilitation helps those mechanisms play out differently depending on the context.
That's a key point. Type 4 models often focus less on listing every single resource and activity, and more on the essential functions the intervention needs to perform, allowing flexibility in how those functions are achieved.
It gives room for that necessary variation across settings.
Exactly, while still keeping the core goals in sight.
So, pulling this all together, what are the big implications here? What should people take away from this exploration of logic model types?
Well, maybe the biggest takeaway is that there's no single best type of logic model. The right tool depends on the job.
Horses for courses.
Pretty much. For a simple intervention or just a quick overview, type 1 or 2 might be fine. But if you're dealing with something complex, something designed to adapt, you likely need a more dynamic model, like type 4, to really understand and guide it.
And the paper suggests some principles for developing these more robust type 4 models.
Yes, it outlines a kind of methodology. First, it stresses the need for really robust qualitative research across different sites, using systematic methods like the framework approach to analyze how the intervention actually plays out, and letting the logic model categories help structure that analysis.
So the model and the data analysis inform each other.
Right. Second, the importance of a strong narrative. You need to explain the theory and why a dynamic model is needed. If you find yourself making lots of excuses for your simple diagram, that's a clue.
Makes sense.
Third, they encourage using diverse shapes and arrows, getting creative visually to show those complex relationships, feedback loops, and contingencies. Don't be afraid to move beyond boxes and lines.
Embrace the visual complexity.
Fourth, really map out the full spectrum of context, maybe using inner-outer or micro-meso-macro distinctions to help pinpoint where adaptation is needed.
Yeah.
Fifth, and this is really interesting, they suggest targeting these models primarily at facilitators or implementers.
Not just for funders or high-level planning.
Less for just building initial consensus, and more as a practical tool to help those doing the work anticipate challenges, assess the context they're entering, and plan adaptive strategies. It becomes a navigation aid for them.
Empowering the people on the ground.
Exactly. And finally, they suggest type 4 models are better able to incorporate differences of opinion. Complex problems often don't have one single agreed-upon pathway. A type 4 can potentially show how different factors or pathways might be relevant in different settings, acknowledging that diversity of perspectives.
That's quite a shift in how we might think about using these models. Not just static blueprints, but dynamic guides for navigating complexity.
It really is. It moves away from trying to standardize everything and towards understanding and supporting skillful adaptation.
Okay, so let's summarize. We've seen that traditional logic models, while useful, often struggle with complex healthcare interventions because they don't fully capture how these interventions need to adapt to specific contexts.
Right. They tend to treat context as separate and the intervention process as linear.
And this Type 4 model, inspired by frameworks like Paris, offers a more dynamic approach. It uses visual elements like Venn diagrams and different arrow types to show the interplay between facilitation, context, and the core intervention mechanisms.
And importantly, the goal shifts. It's less about forcing one single picture and more about providing a tool to help implementers understand and respond effectively to the unique realities of each setting they work in.
This has been fascinating. It really highlights how often we might be trying to apply overly simplistic frameworks to inherently messy, complex situations. It leaves me with a thought, maybe for you listening too. How might this lens, this focus on the dynamic relationship between an intervention, its context, and the need for skilled adaptation change how we approach problem solving in other complex areas? Think about education or community development or even business strategy. Where else do we need models that embrace, rather than ignore, complexity and adaptation? Definitely something to chew on.